Angelica. After Desiree sings I Am the Place Where God Shows Up by Eddie Watkins Jr., Wendy will share her message with us. Then Desiree will prepare us for meditation by singing Right Where I Am by Jason and DeMarco. Wendy will then guide us in meditation, and Desiree will sing us back into the third dimension. Get ready for a trip beyond words.
Am I strong enough to bear the burdens that sometimes come living this thing called life? Am I wise enough to make the right decisions when I'm standing at the fork in the road? Sometimes I wonder and ponder, only to realize I'm not alone. There's nothing I have to do on my own, 'cause I am the place where God lives, moves and breathes and has its being. I am the place where God shows up. I am the place where God lives, moves and breathes and has its being. I am the place where God shows up. Will I have enough to do the things I need to do to take care of myself? Will I have the health, the mind and body to live the life of grace and wholeness? Sometimes I wonder and ponder, only to realize I'm not alone and there's nothing I have to do on my own, 'cause I am the place where God lives, moves and breathes and has its being. I am the place where God shows up. I am the place where God lives, moves and breathes and has its being. I am the place where God shows up. I am the place and you are the place, and we are the place where God shows up. I am the place and you are the place, and we are the place where God shows up. I am the place and you are the place, and we are the place where God shows up. I am the place and you are the place, and we are the place where God shows up. I am the place and you are the place, and we are the place where God shows up. And I am the place and you are the place, and we are the place where God shows up. Good.
Thank you, everybody. That was wonderful. It's one of my favorite songs. So welcome to a birthday party. Our co-founders, Myrtle and Charles Fillmore, were both born in the month of August. And today I'm going to share a talk that when I first gave it in 1995 was called No Gift is Too Small. And what I've learned about the Fillmores in all the years I've been studying them is something that's applicable to all of us, that we have gifts in our lives, we have skills that we may not realize, and that when we are open and receptive to sharing them with the world, great things can happen. So we're going to go back in time, so strap in. So this is the thriving community of Pagetown. And on the right, you see some of Myrtle's family. Not exactly the most cheerful looking bunch of folks that I've seen. I can't identify any of them. The archivist who had documented this had just put Page relatives. That was her maiden name. But if you go to Pagetown in Ohio, I haven't myself, but back in the day, there was you could see there was a historical marker and a marker to tell you to go look at the historical marker. So clearly it was a part of Ohio's history. So what we know about Myrtle, she was born on the 6th of August in 1845, which, if my math is correct, means that we're quite a few years beyond 100 years. And she was the 8th of 9 children. So it was quite a large family, not unusual at the time. She was christened Mary Carolyn, but early on she adopted the name of Myrtle. She was brought up believing that tuberculosis ran in the family, and I'm sure she had some aunts and perhaps other family members that experienced it. And basically, she grew up with the dynamic of don't make plans, you're not going to live very long. This is what your life is going to be like. Now, add on to that the fact that as a woman and an unmarried woman, you know, her career options were very limited. There were very few things you could do as a woman without losing your honor and sense of decorum. And certainly there were a lot of rules about this, and we'll talk about them in a moment. When she was 22, she enrolled at Oberlin College. There was what they called the Literary Course for Ladies, which was a one-year program which would qualify her to have a teaching certificate. And I just want you to turn your mind to that for a moment. You know, compared to the level of teaching education we get, we expect our teachers to have, she would have had 1 year in order to teach in a one-room schoolhouse with an abundance of students and learning styles and subject matter. So, 1 year, it sounded great, but I'm sure she had her days when she felt ill-prepared to do what she was doing. After she graduated, she moved to Clinton, Missouri. That was where her brother David and his family were living. At this time, living as a single woman was iffy at best. So living with her brother and family was a good choice for keeping her reputation. She did have some challenges with her health, and we see that she moves farther and farther south, no doubt trying to escape the winter and all the ills that come with that. So around the age of 30, give or take, she secured a teaching position in Denison, Texas. And we know for certain in 1876, she was in a literary society in Denison. And the reason we know this is because we are told in an autobiographical piece that Charles Fillmore meets her in Denison, and that they were at a literary group, and that when she stood up to do a recitation, something inside him said, "There's your wife." Now, she returns in 1878 to teach in Clinton, but she maintains correspondence with Charles. And on the 29th of March of 1881, she marries Charles in the Little Methodist Church in Clinton, Missouri. Now, I don't think we've ever seen this since, but her fourth grade students were so distraught because the rules at the time meant that she, now a married woman, would have to suspend her teaching career. They loved her and they protested, not only within the church itself, but outside. And the newspapers of the time tell us that the students were protesting against the wicked Mr. Fillmore, who took their beloved teacher from them. After the ceremony, Charles and Myrtle got on the train for Gunnison, Colorado, where Charles was working at the time. We'll talk about his career in a moment. And she was admired by the other people on their travels. Apparently, it was quite a tumultuous journey involving stagecoaches, sleighs, and trains. So they got to Gunnison, started their married life, and things turned sour. And Charles had been in real estate, and they decided to move to Pueblo, Colorado, in part for Myrtle's health, in part because that's where the boom town was. So we'll just pause the story there for a moment and let me fill you in on Charles's background. So he was born in Minnesota, outside of St. Cloud. And his mother, Mary, it ends up that she's actually not much older than Myrtle. There's an interesting dynamic there once they get married. But Grandma Fillmore I have to mention because she was born in Nova Scotia. We think around 1836. And she was taken to the US by her father when she was a child. And she met her future husband, Henry, when she was 18. She had two sons, Charles, who was born in 1854, and Norton, who was born 2 years later. Now, Henry abandons the family and he builds his own cabin about 10 miles away. So Charles grew up in this interesting dynamic of spending time with his mom and time with his dad. Something I was actually kind of surprised to find. You know, we usually think of that as being something that really emerges in the 1970s, not the 1850s. So here we have two young photos of Charles. I suspect that the bicycle one is definitely staged because there's no record of him having a bicycle, and certainly this is probably before his skating accident when he injured his leg and was left pretty much a shut-in. But he took advantage of his own sense of well-being, and he persuaded a woman who was named Caroline to teach him. She was homeschooling her own son, and he asked her to if she could be a student as well. Now, what's interesting is that Carolyn had gone to Oberlin College and taken the ladies' literary course. So Charles indirectly was receiving the same education and being exposed to the same writers that Myrtle was. So even though they had very different family upbringings, Charles had no inclination for religious activity. Myrtle was very involved with the Methodist Church. Even in spite of that difference, they had an intellectual understanding, and over time that allowed them to explore their own spiritual concepts. Myrtle, as I said, did have some illness issues. After giving birth to her first two sons, Lowell and Rickert, it was clear her body was suffering from having gone through two pregnancies. And she started to look for a solution. I mean, who wouldn't? You're a mom with two young kids. This isn't how it's supposed to be. And her son Lowell writes that, you know, anybody who came through town with a lotion or potion was invited to come and ply their wares, and that they had a chest full of all these lotions and potions. Around 1886, Myrtle goes to a lecture. I mean, what else is there to do? You're grasping at straws for something that will help heal her. We don't know what was said other than the one line that Myrtle captures. I am a child of God, and therefore I do not inherit sickness. And she starts working with this idea, and she starts spending time alone, praying, and talking to her body, asking its forgiveness for the thoughts that she had held, that it was sickly, that it was weak, that it was anything less than God's perfection. Charles, being much more intellectual and not having had much exposure to things spiritual or religious, pays a bit of attention, but then he really starts to pay attention as he sees his wife getting better. And he starts to read, and Charles was a voracious reader, that for sure we know. And he comes to the conclusion that either I can go directly to headquarters or the whole thing is a fraud. And so he too starts to work on a prayer life. And I want to invite you to, if you're having troubles with a prayer life or meditation, to know that it took him about 3 months before he felt like he was really getting it. Now, by the end of his life, he was spending about 8 hours a day in prayer and meditation. And indeed, I was told by his granddaughter that when you asked him a question, he would go silent, close his eyes, and when he had an answer, he'd open his eyes and tell you what the answer was. And she said, I thought all grandfathers did that until I got into school and discovered that he was the only one. So out of this, there came a healing for Myrtle. In fact, in 1889, she gave birth to her third son, and she was in her early 40s at this time. So I know from experience with friends of mine that an older birth at this time in 2020 is difficult. One can only imagine what it would have been like in 1889 without the health care that we take for granted sometimes nowadays. So out of this, though, we all know what happens when something amazing or miraculous is in our midst. We want to know more. We want to be part of it. And this is what happened. Myrtle would see someone, who seemed to be having a down day, and she'd invite them to come into the parlor and have some time of prayer. She invited one person to come in, and they had some prayers, and he left without his crutches. So there was action that was happening because of the prayer work that these two were doing. It was never their intention to do anything that would replace a church or to create a church. That wasn't their intention. Their intention was to enhance everyone's prayer life with some spiritual principles that they had not only discovered, but had proven in their own lives, in their own health and well-being. So out of this, there came a movement and a request that perhaps they could have a regular service, perhaps Sunday evening when people weren't at church, and perhaps they could have a midweek service. And eventually by 1891, we have a publication that comes out that asks the question, are you interested? And it outlines how to form a unity study group. At that point, it was primarily prayer time, but there were some readings that were becoming published. We start to see the works of Emily Cady coming out. Certainly Charles and Myrtle had quite a bit to say in the early days, with the focus being on affirmative prayer, not on beseeching prayer or any kind of condemnatory prayer, but on affirming the truth that is, on affirming the idea that spiritual principles are equal to physical principles, that they are universal, applicable to everyone. In 1892, Charles and Myrtle wrote their dedication and covenant. What I found interesting about this was that no one found it. It was hidden in the works, in the papers of Myrtle. And it wasn't until they were unpacking her materials at what is now Unity Village that they found this dedication and covenant. And it reads, we, Charles Fillmore and Myrtle Fillmore, husband and wife, hereby dedicate ourselves, our time, our money, all we have and all we expect to have, to the Spirit of Truth, and through it to the Society of Silent Unity. It being understood and agreed that the said Spirit of Truth shall render unto us an equivalent for this dedication in peace of mind, health of body, wisdom, understanding, love, life, and an abundant supply of all things necessary to meet every want, without our making any of these things the object of our existence. In the presence of the conscious mind of Jesus Christ, the 7th day of December, AD 1892, and you can see it's signed by both of them. This dedication and covenant informed where the unity movement would go in the early days. The intention was to spread the word. The intention was to share the knowledge that they had discovered. And this was done primarily through Silent Unity, our prayer branch. But also in the 20s, we had a radio station, and that allowed the word to go across the world. In fact, I was blessed to have met someone who shared with me that because of the way things worked in the 20s, Charles would sneak into the radio station and turn the gain up way beyond what his license allowed, because he knew nobody was watching, nobody was paying attention, nobody was checking to see that he was in compliance in the wee small hours of the morning. But what it meant was that the message was getting to Africa. And I was talking with someone who made me aware that people would walk for miles in Africa to whoever had a transistor radio, and that for a long time there were children who were named Charles and Myrtle, strictly because they had heard the words of Charles and other unity leaders on the radio back in the 20s. 1925, we have a nice picture of Charles and Myrtle. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. What these two brought to our movement was not only this dedication and covenant, but a lifetime of experience. Charles had been in real estate. He had been in a bank. He had worked as a mule driver, almost losing his life when his load went over a cliff. Myrtle had been a teacher. And as we got into a place where the demand became, we want unity to be our primary spiritual path, not just an add-on to whatever path we're on, these skills came very handy. Charles and Myrtle were able to publish their own materials. Now, there was a time when the fees were not being paid properly, and somebody was at the door and wanting to take back the equipment, and it was decided to take the issue into prayer. And someone said, "Let us pray that the money holds out." And Myrtle is reported to have quietly said, "No, let us pray that our faith holds out." They were very clear in their mission. They were very clear in going to God first. That was different than many of the other New Thought groups of the time. Myrtle took into prayer, "Who will take after the children?" And the voice came back to her, "Well, you're a teacher, you will." Myrtle pioneered We Wisdom, which was a magazine for children that ran for 100 years, something that's been unequaled. And I've actually discovered that there were a lot of people who were involved in We Wisdom who may not have known of its religious affiliation. I remember seeing it in my public library growing up, long before I knew there was a spiritual community called Unity. Charles not only brought the printing press to Unity, but he brought the ability to record, press, and sell their own recordings. And if you go to truthunity.net, you can hear some of these early recordings. So others join in the movement. This is a family photo, as you might have guessed. In the back row, left to right, our first son, Lowell, second son, Rickard, third son, Royal, and then Myrtle, Charles, and Grandma Fillmore. I want to just give a little more to Grandma Fillmore. So Grandma Fillmore didn't buy into all this spiritual stuff. But what Grandma Fillmore brought to our movement was that she did the cooking, she did the cleaning, she looked after the boys. She freed Charles and Myrtle up to pursue their spiritual paths. I've often heard ministers and spiritual leaders say they wish they had a Grandma Fillmore. Now, Charles, he lived dangerously. There were many times after service he would say, "All right, everybody back to Mother's house for lunch." And apparently she could pull magic out of a hat with, as James Dillett Freeman described it, with a handful of beans, a stock pot, and a soup bone. Number 3 son we give thanks for, he actually died first, but he was the one who suggested that it was necessary to have a place where people could visit and be out of the city. And it was from his education and his knowledge and his understanding that we now have Unity Village. Lowell took on the roles of his father after Charles decided to stop being the leader of the movement. Rickard, we give thanks for because he designed all of the beautiful architecture at Unity Village, and even later buildings that weren't directly designed by him pay homage to him. When Unity, the Silent Unity building, the current one, was built, there was some ruckus about it, that it had been a nice green space. But when you look at a video that was made in 1926, you see that Rickard had actually planned for a building about the same size and shape to be in that space on the campus. Myrtle brought with her the heart. She was the leader of Silent Unity for many years before handing it off to May Rowland. And if you go to Kansas City, Missouri, and you go to Unity Church Universal, which was the first Unity home, and you sit in the place where Myrtle prayed, or you go to Unity Village, you go to her office there, you can still feel the presence, that heart, that willingness to share with the world the love. So I could tell you a lot more about Unity folk and Unity upbringing. There's a 10-hour course, and I have more material than I need for even that. But let me leave you with a couple questions. Something to think about, something to take with you. What gifts do I have? On the surface, Charles and Myrtle did not look like people who would become the co-founders of an international spiritual movement, but yet they each brought to the table small gifts that, when multiplied not only with those of each other, but of their children, of their family members, of people who were key and actively involved in the movement in the early days, that they become multiplied to the point that they're greater than the sum of its parts. The next question is, am I willing to share these gifts with the world? It's very easy, as scripture says, to put the light under a bushel. But we're called to, and Charles and Myrtle have demonstrated the importance of being willing to share our gifts. However small or insignificant the world may tell us they are, that there is something greater that can be brought out. How do these gifts align with the gifts of people in my circle? Ever notice that you get an idea for something and all of a sudden people start showing up in your life that either support you, whether it's financially or just being your cheerleaders, or that you get someone who has a talent or a skill that you need. I remember in my early days in Unity, when I was at Unity of Hamilton, when they had a retreat center, we were always amazed that we would need
We seem to have some technical difficulties and hope that when Wendy just froze, we're going to have a moment to give her a chance to get back into the system. Bear with us.
I think I got lost. I think I got thrown off, and I have no idea where I was when that happened.
You were at the second question, what will sharing my gifts look like?
Oh, awesome. Okay. Do I need to redo that one, or did I get enough of it in?
No, please do.
Okay. All right. So the final question is, what am I willing to receive? Remember, our co-founders had a dedication and covenant, but it wasn't just about what they were willing to give. It was about what they expected to receive. It's a joint process. It is a combination. It's an agreement. I mean, you look at that, and I'm sure Pixie would have some comments about this. It looks like a legal document with God saying, this is what we will give, and this is what we expect to receive. I mean, that's pretty amazing to me. That's not what I grew up with. That idea that as a child of God, I can claim my good, I can claim it in a way that I want, and that is meaningful to me. So I submit these 5 questions to you to take and ponder. Is there something? Is there a place for you to stretch just a little bit more? It doesn't have to be huge. But look at what these two, who on the surface, you know, she's got tuberculosis. She's not in good health. Charles is not in good health until he starts working, and by the end of his life, he is in much better health than he was as a teenager. What is it that we can do? How is it we can honor their paths by following their examples? Not to put them on a pedestal, but to say, this is what you have taught me. This is how I am going to share my gift with the world. And with that, I will invite Desiree to sing us into meditation.
Right where I I couldn't be any closer. Right where I stand, the presence of God is holding me. Right where I am, right where I am, I couldn't be any closer. Right where I stand, the presence of God is holding me. Right where I am.
Thank you. And now, as we move into our time of quiet, of meditation and prayer, I invite you to do three things. To be aware that whatever you're sitting on or in has divine wisdom, knows how to support you, and you can allow your body to relax just a little bit more. If you need to do a little wiggle, please do. And secondly, I invite you to allow my words and my voice to be your words and your voice in the next little while. And finally, I invite you to go to that space within your physical body where you feel connection. If you wish to close your eyes or look at the floor, that's fine. But to find that space where you feel the I am of your being, that space where you feel oneness, that space where you feel safe, that space where you know you are a child of the divine. And we'll just take a few moments to breathe into that space. And as our co-founders have taught us and shared with us in their many writings, in the transcripts of their Sunday talks and classes, we open ourselves to this consciousness that I am a child of God, that whatever I have been taught before, I can let go. Any thoughts that I may have had about being unworthy or about being less than, I can release. And I can choose to step forward. I can choose to step forward and say, here I am. This is what I have to bring to this universe. This is what makes me uniquely a child of God. This is what my path has led me to. I invite you to take a few moments and just breathe into that idea of what is yours to bring, what is yours to share. We know and acknowledge that we are not alone on this journey. And we affirm that others are with us, regardless of the appearance of distance or social distancing or needing to use technology to bring us together, that we are truly one, that truly we have gifts not only to share from ourselves, but to bring to another and to share jointly. just as our co-founders did with people they attracted in the early days. So Unity of White Rock is attracting folks with new and exciting skill sets, with knowledge bases, with a desire to share of their own gifts. And in this consciousness, we also bring to mind what it is we want to receive. For it is truly a circle of giving and receiving. And as we breathe into this, we acknowledge our willingness, our openness. And now I invite you to join me in sharing the gift of prayer, holding in our hearts and minds all those who we have on our own personal prayer list, all names in the prayer list at Unity of White Rock. Indeed, all prayer requests everywhere. We hold in our mind and hearts the oneness that we are, affirming with and for everyone that there is love enough, there is peace enough, there is abundance enough, that as we grow in our understanding, that these gifts will come to us, and that as we overflow in our understanding, we cannot help but share them with the world. And we give thanks for Charles and Myrtle, for Grandma Fillmore, for Lowell, Rickert, and Royal, for all of the early Unity workers and writers who caught a vision of a world that works for all. A world where we could go directly to headquarters and experience our divinity in its fullness. And for this time together, for the technology that has allowed us to come together in challenging times, we are so grateful. And so it is, and so it shall be. Amen.
Right where I am, I couldn't be any closer. Right where I stand, the presence of God is holding me. Right where I am, right where I am, I couldn't be any closer. Right where I stand, the presence of God is holding me. Right where I am. We are grateful for this moment right here and now, for this sacred time together, and for this blessed unity spiritual community. For Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, listening and seeking for a deeper truth, and dedicating their lives to being students of teachers of truth that brings us together and brings me right here and now. I couldn't be any closer, right where I stand. The presence of God is holding me, right where I am, right where I am. I couldn't be any closer, right where I stand. The presence of God is holding me, right where I am.
Well, thank you so much, Wendy, for your fascinating message and comforting meditation. And thank you, Desiree, and the Little Unity Band That Can, for sharing your delightful songs.